Thank you so much, Bob, for a very generous introduction. It's really good to be back here again after almost 18 months. And this is my first time traveling abroad during this pandemic. And I do hope that I'm going to be able to continue traveling. And the United States is the first country to visit, so feel like home again. And also going back to Washington, D.C. with a different administration, that should be also underlined. Very good afternoon to all of you. The topic of today is about the Indonesia economic outlook as well as development priority, as we are going to become the presidents of the G20 meeting, which is starting this December, in which we will start with deputy meeting. So it's really good to be here again, to be able to update you where we are after 1.5 years, the whole world facing with this COVID. I think it's really a humbling experience to all of us. When I took the job again, and President Jokowi asked me to go back to Indonesia and take the same position as a finance minister, so it is considered as a veteran finance minister. Of course, at that time, the focus is really how to support President Jokowi's vision to build Indonesia, the foundation right, the policy right, and especially investing in human capital as well as infrastructure. And the position as the finance minister is not easy, because all the goals, the target, the dream, they are all need money. So how you are going to combine between achieving the goals without creating sustainability problem. And that's really that kind of relationship that, of course, between finance minister and the president and with the parliament. Edgar asking and Bob's asking me to talk about a little bit about democracy in Indonesia. You can compare with your own system here. So when we are having this development need as middle-income countries, everybody knows not all middle-income countries can become a high-income country. I think I have a colleague here, Vikram, over there. He's the one who's always seen, because he was my colleague in the World Bank, talking about middle-income trap. So only a few countries can pursue their continued progress toward high-income country. So Indonesia is quite obsessed with this middle-income trap. When I came back, and then we discussed in the cabinet, within my own team in the Ministry of Finance, how Indonesia can avoid middle-income trap. And that's why, again, you have to open the World Bank literature back in the ASEAN Tiger, ASEAN Miracle, middle-income trap. I was in the bank as a managing director, and then at that time we have one study which is related to how China can avoid middle-income trap also. So I'm overseeing that study. So a lot of, at least, understanding about what is the policy framework, regulatory framework, fundamental that need to be addressed. In Indonesia, that means, first, of course, human capital. So when David Boblik mentioned about LPDB or education, the human capital is very, very critical. Everybody agree about that. The question is how you are going to address the issue of human capital to improve it. Because you can say in a rhetoric level, human capital important, full stop. Or human capital is important, comma, how we are going to do it. And that is exactly the issue that we are now addressing. Which is very exciting because we have now the education minister, the youngest ever minister, 32 years, the founder of Gojek, and the president just asking him, and before he take the job, he's asking me, should I take this job? And then, why not? Well, do I have friends in the cabinet? You are not considering me as a friend? I said. Well, he used to call me Tante. Tante is auntie. Because I'm a friend with his parent. So I said, okay, I'm not your friend, I'm your aunt. So you're going to be even safer, right? So we have this conversation in order for us to be able to then define how we are going to push the reform in education, because Indonesia spent 20% of our budget for education, mandatory by our constitution. And that means a lot of implication. My first term as the finance minister under President Yudhoyono, that was when the Constitutional Court telling us that you should comply, because if it is not, president can be impeached if you're not allocating 20% of your budget for education. Suddenly, I have to allocate those money for education when we are not ready to spend it right? So the Minister of Education have the problem to spend the money. So what happened, many schools is asking for just painting the wall again, buying furniture, just to spend the money. And at that time, we then decided we should use this money wisely. And that's how we start with the LPDP, that is the Sovereign Wealth Fund a la Indonesia. That is, we save this money for the next generation. You don't have to spend it every year, and that's it. So we put it, what we call it, the investment fund. Then the president also think about supporting for research, for cultural. So then we provided this window within this. But that is exactly, money is one thing, the program or the reform on education is another thing. That's also another challenge, because Indonesia is a big decentralized country, democratic and decentralized. Education and health is two functions which is delegated to the local level. So you have to deal, here in the United States, I think I frequently read the news or listen to the television, and you always said, it is important for you to get the synergy or agreement, so you have to cross the aisle, right? You do this to get the agreement of the two parties, democracy that you have. In Indonesia, we have a lot of aisles, because we have 10 parties within the parliament, and also at the same time, of course, the coalition itself, and between the coalition and outside the coalition, there is quite a fluid relationship, but functioning. Our democracy is functioning. So in this case, we discuss about how we are going to use, in this decentralized setup, how the reform in education and health, which is related to the local government, in which most of the time, local government have their own local party, which is different from the coalition of the central party. I can explain you until overnight, but still functioning, meaning that we can make decisions, we deliver. And that's exactly what the Minister of Education and Health is doing to reform on a human capital aspect. The health is different, because we then trigger by this COVID, we suddenly realized that the health system in Indonesia needs a lot of work. It's another complication, but still the blessing of this COVID is we are seeing how we need to fix this health system in Indonesia. So this is the human capital is one most important element of avoiding middle income trap. The second one, infrastructure. Indonesia is lagged behind, and President Jokowi really want to catch up with a lot of development. Sometimes we use the state-owned enterprises, sometimes we use pure budget, sometimes we use public-private partnership. And this has a lot of dimension. My job as a finance minister is to make sure that the idea to develop infrastructure will not end up with financial crisis, governance crisis, or even the project which is not finished. And this is not easy, especially then suddenly we have this COVID. So at this very moment during this COVID, I have to go through with the Minister of State-owned Enterprise to look at all the balances of the SOE. And of course, then we have to say that in order for us to be able to deliver the infrastructure, invite more capital, we really need to have a different strategy of financing, not rely too much only from the government as well as SOE. And that's require a fundamental reform, because money come to Indonesia, their first choice is to lend us, because that is the easiest and maybe the safest way. Especially they love to buy government bonds, right? But we want money to come to Indonesia not only in the form of borrowing. We will still need that, but it should be in equity financing or investment FDI. But that's require a lot of work to make this capital have the confidence to come to Indonesia, to stay in Indonesia, to work, and then to generate return, revenue and return for both the investors as well as the economy. And that's what we call it, the investment climate reform. So President Jokowi recognized that you cannot use excessively all this leverage, so you really have to do the hardest work, that is reforming the fundamental of Indonesia economy. And we delivered that, even during this pandemic. Bob Blake mentioned that I was finance minister during global financial crisis. We used the crisis to even trigger the reform. So we never waste the crisis. We have the global financial crisis at that time, then we reform. Central bank function to become more independent, focusing on the exchange rate and inflation, stability. Then we created the OJK, that is Financial Sector Regulatory Authority, which is also independent, and integrating the whole supervisory of the financial sector. Then we have this pandemic, in which we use this crisis, health crisis, to trigger all the reform. So even during this pandemic, which I don't know how in the United States, but I remember, because when WHO announcing that this is the pandemic, that was in March 11, that is the my late mother birthday. So I always remember that day as when the pandemic. And then after announcement, suddenly everybody have to stay home. As a finance minister, then you suddenly have to think, what's going to happen? The only literature that I look at from Google, of course, I Google it. What is this pandemic? What is this COVID? And then the information back in 1918, when you have the Spanish flu. And then I try to understand, okay, what is the Spanish flu? How long it takes? Okay, maybe 3 years is going to be the maximum. So we submitted to the parliament the emergency law, President, which saying that we are going to have these 3 years extraordinary years. We cannot use all the ordinary policy pre-COVID. What is the extraordinary thing? First, of course, with the COVID, everybody has to stay home. I don't know how long, But for sure, there will be no activity. If there is no activity, that means no economy which is going to happen, I mean, no activity. Then who's going to pay my tax? So the question at that time for us is how deep the contraction on our revenue. It is going to be contracted, but the question is how deep. And at the same time, because of the COVID, that we have to make sure that the health spending definitely will increase. At that time, also the health minister have no idea about how much they are going to need for this COVID-related spending. So we said, okay, why don't you work on the whatever program to deal with the COVID? Don't think about the money. I'm going to provide the money, whatever you need for the health. So then I received huge, long shopping list, of course. Hospital upgrading, puskesmas, incentive for the medical doctor and health staff, and all those things. Not to mention, of course, the first critical weeks or months, we really have to fight for masks, because the masks are competing between exported or used in domestically. We have to negotiate. Can you imagine the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Finance, because custom is under Minister of Finance in Indonesia. So I'm with Retno, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, have to negotiate and call the ambassador of Japan and South Korea, because we prevent the production of protective gear, which is manufactured in Indonesia. It is ordered from Japan and South Korea, supposed to be re-export. And I said, no, you cannot export. Why? Because at that time, we don't have any adequate protective gear. Then we have to negotiate. Okay, I can export one half and one half for Indonesia. You have to order me again, and I'm going to. So that kind of, what you call it, emergency situation that require a totally different management. I was economist during the financial crisis, Asia 97-98. That was when Vikram worked in Indonesia and dealing with banking crises in Indonesia. That was balance sheet problem. Spill over to the social, economic, political. 2008-2009, global financial crisis hit sentiment again. It is, the transmission is through balance sheet. This one, we are dealing with virus, which we cannot see, but then can ruin everything. The balance sheet of the household, balance sheet of corporation, balance sheet of company, balance sheet of the government, of course. So you really have to think how this domino effect is going to come. And that's why during this crisis, we then recognize that we need to reform even further. And President, of course, in this case, take a lead to make sure that the reform is going to be delivered. First, on the step of reform, legislation. The second one is the implementation of that legislation. And that's why during this COVID, we were able not only producing the legislation which is extraordinary, especially for the fiscal policy to be able to have a wider deficit. Traditionally in Indonesia, we are not allowed to have a deficit more than 3% of GDP. So we start with a debt to GDP ratio 38% of GDP, which is considered low, but for Indonesia, it's just way too high. They don't like the word debt, actually. And also the deficit should not more exceeding than 3% of GDP. So we are always like in the low end, around 2%, or even before the COVID was 1.76%. And because of COVID, then we said that we are allowed to have a deficit more than 3%. I will give you one anecdotal cabinet meeting. Don't underestimate your influence, United States. At that particular cabinet meeting, when we decide, okay, how big deficit for Indonesia in order to manage all this extraordinary situation, some minister, of course, following news, and they see that United States is going to increase the deficit into 11%. And they said, well, United States is actually having deficit 11%. Sri Mulyani, you should allow that we should have the deficit 15% of GDP. And I said, what? And then, okay, calm down. Let us now calculate how much you need to spend and how able you are going to be able to spend. Because I can give you a lot of money and you just stay at home. So what's this money for? So that kind of conversation is actually just showing. But I will provide you with whatever resources you need to deal with this COVID. But I'm not going to like open my purse and saying that you can take whatever you want. That kind of conversation that the United States, even as the biggest economy in the world, you are running deficit which is very high in order for you to be able to deal with this extraordinary situation. And that's put a lot of pressure for a country like us. And my surrounding neighbor country also have a deficit which is very deep, double digit. They are all double digit deficit. So when we finally come up with, initially we revised 5.7% to 6.4%, and we end up with 6.1%. That is the deficit last year. And the result on our economy, the contraction is relatively mild or modest. Indonesia suffering from this COVID, the contraction at the level of minus 2.1%. So single-digit deficit with very mild contraction. Comparing to my neighboring country, double-digit deficit and double-digit contraction. That's a good start, showing that, okay, what we are doing is very calculated and measured, but we also use this momentum to do the hardest part of the homework, that is reforming the economy. And then, President, after this COVID, definitely we are going to end up with a higher debt, and that's why we have to make sure that capital come to Indonesia, not in the form of borrowing, but in the form of FDI and equity financing. So we created the Omnibus Law on Job Creation, the first time in the history of Indonesia to reform many laws in one legislation. I think one of the ministers who said that, Omnibus Law, this is like in the United States, see? You should not underestimate your influence in this case. Omnibus Law, so everybody loves the word Omnibus Law. So we put everything in this law. The labor, environmental, tax, and then what else? Small, medium enterprises. What else, Pa Febrio? Environment, labor, I've already said that. So investment registration, licensing, what else? Energy. So we put everything in one law. And then we discussed within the cabinet, okay, this is going to be a very thick law. It's okay. So while you cannot go everywhere because you are all stay home, but we can still work through the Zoom, it's good for us to concentrate on this law, right? So we use those time to really intensify all our attention. Because the minister cannot traveling, president cannot traveling, we all cannot traveling, the parliament cannot traveling, so we are all grounded. But grounded doesn't mean that we are not doing anything. So the political process is actually happening. We discuss, communicate, consult, and of course, a lot of meeting in order for us to be able. And that's how we pass. Actually, at that time, we are thinking that, oh, this COVID, we should delay this legislation. But President is insisting that we have to do that. So we've already passed this law. But that's not the end of the story. That is the beginning of the reform. And as a finance minister, I also then have another law that is on a tax law, which is related, we don't want to use the omnibus because the parliament say, don't use the omnibus anymore. That is only for that omnibus. This one is just a compilation of a few tax legislation, VAT, income tax, general provision, excise, customs, yeah, in this case, we put it together in this one law. And we also discussed again with the parliament why we need this fiscal reform, especially on the revenue side. Well, you know, first, we have a lot of bill to pay because of this COVID. You don't like big deficit, you don't like high debt to GDP ratio. People also don't like that. Also, Indonesia, again, we are still in the 42% of GDP debt. The Indonesia really don't like that. So if you don't like higher debt, higher deficit, the only thing, then you have to pay tax. That's a policy choice. And they said, okay, but don't be too rushed because we are still in a COVID and people purchasing power is weakened and the demand is so weak. So it's about timing rather than the discussion about whether you need it or not. And so we discussed a lot of things within this tax reform. And just last week, including the carbon tax. I think Jacob is going to find it envy us in this case. We discussed with the parliament saying that, okay, the trend globally, climate change is a threat. The threat is similar to COVID. That's even maybe bigger because it can really destroy a lot of infrastructure that we just built. And I think in terms of this climate change recognition in Indonesia, almost all party, there is none of the party which is actually saying that they don't believe in climate change and they against, anyone is not saying that they are against a program to address this issue. So that's a good start for us, a much better advantage. And then they're asking us, especially within the Ministry of Finance, what is going to be the plan. So that's why we discuss on how we are going to introduce the value of carbon. If you are not valuing something, then that is not important. If this is so important, there should be a value. There must be a value of that thing. And they agree, oh, okay. And in order for us to test whether this value is valid, then you really have to create a market. So we have to create carbon market, okay. And in order not to disrupt this recovery process, then we should start for the area which is very critically important. Two very important areas which contributing the CO2. Although Jacob mentioned about methane in this case, but on ours, we are on the forestry and energy. John Kerry came to Indonesia and talking about coal. Secretary Yellen also talking about climate change. So it's good to see the United States back in this business. And we discuss about how, in this, we mean that the government and the parliament discuss about how we are going to address this issue of climate change. So in the latest legislation, which just passed last week, we put this carbon market, carbon price, carbon tax, but will not be implemented immediately. The government have to submit the action plan for us to address this issue. What I'm saying is that the democracy in Indonesia is functioning. we can have a differences in view, they can criticize us, but at the same time, they also know that we have to make decision. And the decision maybe is not satisfying all parties, but at the end, you have to make decision. And the more that the government able to present and prepare the framework, I think it's much easier for the party to be able to make decision, because they can then frame it in whatever the language, on the political language for their constituent. But the most important is the policy itself is actually can be prepared in a technocratic way, and then we have to make sure that this is going to suit the Indonesian population as well as business. I know that this carbon market is going to be sensitive. So the first, and especially because everybody talking about coal or in a forestry, that means you are talking about palm oil, then you have to talk with those. Because if you're not talking with them, they can easily hijack and say that I don't like this one. So as Bob mentioned in his introduction, that Sri Mulyani is always communicate with the business. I think when you are in a position of making policy which is public, then you have to really deal with the public, including the interest group. So we discuss with them. If we are going, Indonesia have the national determined contribution, reducing CO2 29% by our own and 41% with international support. And this is actually announced by President Yudhoyono. So this president continue honoring this commitment. And of course, these are all the party which is in the previous administration as well in the administration of this one. So the beauty of this is all 10 parties, they are all actually the support of this, the NDC. So the question is more on how. And that's exactly what we are trying to do in communicating with all business community, especially those interest groups, and saying that what kind of transition that is just and affordable. Just mean the polluter pay, but in an affordable way, which is going not to kill the business, not to kill the people, in this case, not to kill the government. And that is exactly now the role of finance ministry, my team in this case, I have all my colleagues here, I can call after my speech. They are all preparing all this policy framework. And we have a very good, very constructive discussion with them. And that's why we were able to frame it in this legislation and pass. So that's a good side about Indonesia democracy, as well as addressing the issue which is fundamentally important for our country or for our economy. The next thing I'm going to talk about the digital economy. COVID forced us to use or to transform all the business interaction through the digital technology, including all the business. We were lucky Indonesia have a unicorn, so this idea about selling and buying using digital platform is already actually have quite a vibrant follower, especially among the millennials. So when the COVID happened, the pandemic happened, they just accelerating this transformation, including, of course, the government. I now never actually have any printing document, so everything is now digital. In Ministry of Finance have already have a roadmap for transforming to become a digital and knowledge institution, but we have a time frame of 3 years. And then suddenly overnight with this COVID, we have to move forward this 3 years roadmap to become overnight. Of course, there is some glitches, but it's working. So now actually, as a finance minister in a cabinet meeting, I will say to all the cabinet minister, actually we don't need office. So I can cut the budget for all of you. And The budget for traveling, I can also cut into 1/4. Because you really don't need to travel because you do it via Zoom and whatever. So suddenly then they are threatened by this reality. Because I'm going to use this money not to save or reducing deficit, I'm going to use it for other. Of course, education, health, as well as some infrastructure, including the digital infrastructure. Because we still have more than 9,000 villages which is not yet connected with the internet. And that's why we're scaling up our investment, whether this is on satellite, broadband, fiber optic, and even we call it BTS, that is a tower, because on a remote area, it's a big business in Indonesia. So this is the area which is, even during COVID, of course, they are booming. And that's exactly how we see the transformation is even more accelerated. Certainly, it is not only about a hard infrastructure. We need to protect the data. Data security is very, very important. Property right, taxation. So I'm glad that today, during the G20 meeting, we just concluded with the chair from Italy, one of the achievements is on the global taxation agreement, which is, I think, is a good start for all of us. As a veteran finance minister, I was finance minister 15 years ago. And at that time, I also see that the revenue from tax in Indonesia easily eroded with the, what you call it, base erosion, profit shifting, and tax avoidance. And when I discuss in the G20 or many forums internationally, at that time, United States or Europe, they are not interested to talk about this tax evasion. Now, all finance ministers talk about tax evasion. Yay! So now you know the suffering of your tax base if it is going to be eroded easily. So it's good that globally we are all agree, because I think fair taxation and domestic resource mobilization is the necessary condition for this globalization to be continue progressing. If the country feel that they only exploit it, then the globalization is not going to be sustainable. You can make a progress as much as you could, but then it can create a backlash. Populism, a segment of the population which is lag behind, they are not going to be just go away because of time. They will come back, and then they can be very, very ugly in terms of how it can turn the policy as well as the economy or the direction of your country. So I think we really have to be very humble with a lot of progress on digital technology, globalization, mobility of the people. At the same time, we really have to recognize that this system not serve all the people equally. And the challenge for the public policy in creating more unequal prosperity without killing the innovation, the vibrancy of the market is going to be the real challenge for all of us today. And this is exactly what the Indonesia is trying to do, to build the country better and addressing the fundamental issue of our economy. We are taking a very difficult road in this case because we believe it will serve Indonesia better. I firmly believe in this case, this is going to also serve the region and the global, as Edgar mentioned earlier. Indonesia is a big enough country. So if we are well-governed, well-run, and better perform, I think it will be good for the region as well as the world. So that leads to my last issue, that is, or topic, which is related to the chairing of the G20 or the presidency of Indonesia. Of course, taking over from the Italy, and then now it's going to be in Indonesia, we have to create the right balance in terms of the topic. What is the issue which is most important? There is an important which is globally also shared by all. Indonesia chose the theme for the G20, recover together, recover stronger. That is the theme for the G20. And recovery is because we are all hit by the COVID, but also we also recognize that there is still a problem on the global economy. So we will discuss one part is related to the global economy, the downside risk that we are going to face, whether this is related to the diversion, unevenness, access to vaccine, which is not also the luxury of all countries in the world, and also the potential spillover effect of advanced country policy because of the complication of supply chains, energy price, inflation. So these are going to be the area that we are going to discuss for sure, especially on the finance track. COVID also creating scar to the economy. So how this is going to affect short run and medium run, whether this is on a household, people, company, financial institution. We are discussing about this scarring effect of COVID. We also discuss about digitalization, especially on currencies. Central bank digital currency is being one of the discussion, and of course then related to the payment system, cross-border, which is good, but also I can share that there are quite a lot of the discussion regarding interoperability, safety, and all the policy that we need to continue pay attention. We should not sacrifice for the sake of just efficiency vis-a-vis safety. And we will discuss in this G20 under the Indonesia presidency continued discussion on a sustainable finance, in which, very interesting, within the finance track, the Sustainable Finance Working Group is chairing by United States and China. Good luck. That will be nice. I really love those ideas, actually. And that's why this is going to be the discussion about many things. And because Indonesia as a host, I think it's good for us to show the case. And that's why all the policy reform that we are adopting and doing is going to serve the right platform for the discussion and showing also the leadership of Indonesia as a middle income emerging country and developing country, other developing, that you actually can do a lot. Even though the global environment is not yet ready, doesn't mean that you have to wait. And that's exactly what the Indonesia is doing. On the discussion about energy transition, on the discussion about carbon market, carbon tax, and all those, which is going to be very important. The last thing is, of course, on the financial inclusion and international taxation. The international taxation I've already mentioned earlier. On the financial inclusion, this has something to do with the digital technology, how we are going to use this digital technology. Almost all government support to the household now is already in the form of direct transfer to the digital. So we know by name, by address, by account number. And Indonesia, again, is really a destination, a vibrant destination of many technology companies now to invest, whether in the financial side, on digital payment, as well as on other platform. Cloud business is very, very vibrant. So we are very excited with that, and the commitment of President Jokowi is very clear that we should continue do our homework because this is serving Indonesia people. If we are improving investment climate, this is not providing a red carpet for the investor, especially foreign, but this to serve our own interests. And this is exactly what we are trying to do whether this is on the policy side, political communication, as well as the real work on how to reform our institution, our policy, regulation, and the way we work. So that's the story of Indonesia. With all those, hopefully, hard work that we are doing and investing, our economy is recovering. The second quarter growth 7.1%. We are a little bit have a hiccup because of the Delta variant, July. So the third quarter may be a little bit weakened than lower than 7%. But overall, I think this year we are hopefully can still stay above 4%. We are aiming for close to 5%. Next year, we are targeting the projection of the economy is going to be above 5%. And with growth momentum accelerated and stronger, I can start to consolidate our fiscal policy. So I always say that when the economy and the people is sick, the budget step in to help them. But when the economy is getting healthier and people return to the normal situation, then you need to help our budget to then get healthier again. Because you will use that budget when we are in a stormy day. When we are in a sunshine, we are not just partying, we also do our work. When we are in a storm, we also doing our work. That is Indonesia today and the story of our country. Thank you again for coming this afternoon. And I do hope Thank you so much. Thank you so much.